In every quiet town, behind every locked door, something lingers, waiting to be remembered. These are the stories whispered in the dark. True or not, they stay with you just the same. Welcome to the Fright Brothers, where the living tell the tales, and the dead refuse to forget.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Fright Brothers. I am Josh.
And I'm Cody.
And today we have another story for you. Today's episode, we will be reading The Wendigo by Algernon Blackwood. Cody, what do you know about Wendigos?
Well, I have a basic knowledge of them, that it's kind of a malevolent spirit that it can sort of possess or prey upon people, usually if they have recently consumed human flesh, often described in times of desperation, and it can cause some an insatiable hunger in that person if they are possessed. In some instances, it's also described that their mere presence can corrupt or taint their surroundings.
Yeah, I've always heard of them as spirits that, especially during early American folklore and Western expansion of people who got trapped out in the woods, last resort, kind of like the Donner Party, essentially.
Yeah. Where
they're just trapped out there, and by resorting to cannibalism, they transform into these ghoulish figures.
Yeah, and it's the act of cannibalism that's sort of seen as disconnecting you from nature, and in that belief, it is by disconnecting yourself from nature, it's weakening your very soul or spirit.
Yeah. So for most people who aren't informed about Wendigos, the Wendigo is an older Algonquin legend of a spirit that would possess you when you resort to cannibalism. They are often depicted with deer heads, essentially, and they're elongated, humanistic proportions. Very, very terrifying. Probably the more recent iteration of that would be from the video game Until Dawn. It never explicitly says it's a Wendigo, but that's pretty much what I thought that was.
Yeah, that's definitely what they were.
Very interesting. So don't go out in the woods eating people unless you want to become a Wendigo.
Yeah, and from the way it's described, I don't think there's any reason you should ever want to be this kind of thing.
I mean, to each his own,
Yeah, I suppose.
Potato, Some people want to be famous podcasters. Some people want to be musicians. Other people want to be horrible, cannibalistic, supernatural beings.
It is what it is, I suppose.
So just to go off of that, I see a lot of people conflate the two of Skinwalker and Wendigo. Those aren't the same thing, I'm pretty sure. Skinwalker is a person who takes on animal forms, right?
Yeah, the Skinwalker is more of
Oh, you said it.
Oh.
You said it.
Is more of a medicine man or witch doctor kind of scenario where they are able to shapeshift by wearing the skins of something that they've killed.
Okay. Yeah, I know people throw around the word skinwalker anytime there's something weird in the woods.
Yeah.
But there's more than just skinwalkers in the woods, folks.
Well, there's plenty of things that go bump in the night.
Probably the scariest of them all is probably mountain lions, honestly. Well, I say we go ahead and read this story.
Sounds good to me.
The Wendigo by Algernon Blackwood. A considerable number of hunting parties were out that year without finding so much as a fresh trail. The moose were uncommonly shy, and the various Nimrods returned to the bosoms of their respective families with the best excuses the facts of their imagination could suggest. Dr. Cathcart, among others, came back without a trophy, but he brought instead the memory of an experience which he declares was worth all the bull moose that had ever been shot. But then Cathcart of Aberdeen was interested in other things besides moose, among them the vagaries of the human mind. This particular story, however, found no mention in his book on the collective hallucination for the simple reason, so he confided once to a fellow colleague, that he himself played too intimate a part in it to form a competent judgment of the affair as a whole. Besides himself and his guide, Hank Davis, there was young Simpson, his nephew, a divinity student destined for the Wee Kirk, then on his first visit to Canadian backwoods, and the latter's guide Defago. Joseph Defago was a French Canuck who had strayed from his native province of Quebec years before, and had got caught in rat portage when the Canadian Pacific Railway was a building. a man who, in addition to his unparalleled knowledge of woodcraft and bush lore, could also sing the old Voyager songs and tell a capital hunting yarn into the bargain. He was deeply susceptible, moreover, to that singular spell which the wilderness lays upon certain lonely natures, and he loved the wild solitudes with a kind of romantic passion that amounted almost to an obsession. The life of the backwoods fascinated him, whence, doubtless, his surprising efficiency in dealing with their mysteries. On this particular expedition, he was Hank's choice. Hank knew him and swore by him. He also swore at him, just as a pal might. And since he had a vocabulary of picturesque, if utterly meaningless oaths, the conversation between the two stalwart and hardy woodsmen was often of a rather lively description. This river of expletives, however, Hank agreed to dam a little out of respect for his old hunting boss, Dr. Cathcart, whom of course he addressed after the fashion of the country as Doc, and also because he understood that young Simpson was already a bit of a parson. He had, however, one objection to Defago, and one only, which was that the French Canadian sometimes exhibited what Hank described as the output of a cursed and dismal mind, meaning apparently that he sometimes was true to type, Latin type, and suffered fits of a kind of silent moroseness when nothing could induce him to utter speech. Defago, that is to say, was imaginative and melancholy. And as a rule, it was too long a spell of civilization that induced the attacks, for a few days of the wilderness invariably cured them. This, then, was the party of 4 that found themselves in camp last week in October of that shy moose year. Way up in the wilderness, north of Rat Portage, a forsaken and desolate country. There was also Punk, an Indian, who had accompanied Dr. Cathcart and Hank on their hunting trips in previous years, and who acted as cook. His duty was merely to stay in camp, catch fish, and prepare venison steaks and coffee at a few minutes' notice. He dressed in the worn-out clothes bequeathed to him by his former patrons. For all that, however, Punk had in him still the instincts of his dying race. His taciturn silence and his endurance survived, also his superstition. The party round the blazing fire that night were despondent, for a week had passed without a single sign of recent moose discovering itself. Defago had sung his songs and plunged into a story, but Hank, in bad humor, reminded him so often that he kept messing up the facts so that it was most all nothing but a petered-out lie, that the Frenchman had finally subsided into a sulky silence which nothing seemed likely to break. Dr. Cathcart and his nephew were fairly done after an exhausting day. Punk was washing up the dishes, grunting to himself under the lean-to of branches, where he later also slept. No one troubled to stir the slowly dying fire. Overhead the stars were brilliant in a sky quite wintry, and there was so little wind that ice was already forming stealthily along the shores of the still lake behind them. The silence of the vast listening forest stole forward and enveloped them. Hank broke in suddenly with his nasal voice. "I'm in favor of breaking new ground tomorrow, Doc," he observed with energy, looking across at his employer. "We don't stand a dead dago's chance around here." "Agreed," said Cathcart, always a man of few words. "Think the idea's good."
"Sure, Pop, it's good," Hank resumed with confidence. "S'pose now you and I strike west, up Garden Lake way for a change. None of us ain't touched that quiet old bit of land yet."
"I'm with you."
"And you, Defago, take Mr. Simpson along in the small canoe. Skip across the lake portage over into 50 Island water, and take a good squint down the southern shore. The moose yarded there like hell last year, and for all we know, they may be doing it again this year just to spite us."
Defago, keeping his eyes on the fire, said nothing by way of reply. He was still offended, possibly, about his interrupted story.
"No one's been up that way this year, and I'll lay my bottom dollar on that," Hank added with emphasis, as though he had a reason for knowing. He looked over at his partner sharply. "Better take the little silk tent and stay away a couple of nights," he concluded, as though the matter were definitely settled,
for Hank was recognized as a general organizer of the hunt and in charge of the party. It was obvious to anyone that DeFago did not jump at the plan, but his silence seemed to convey something more than ordinary disapproval. And across his sensitive dark face there passed a curious expression like a flash of firelight. Not so quickly, however, that the three men had not time to catch it. "He funked for some reason, I thought," Simpson said afterwards in the tent he shared with his uncle. Dr. Cathcart made no immediate reply, although the look he had interested him enough at a time for him to make mental note of it. The expression had caused him a passing uneasiness. He could not quite account for it at the moment. But Hank, of course, had been the first to notice it, and the odd thing was that instead of becoming explosive or angry over the other's reluctance, he had once begun to humor him a bit. "But there ain't no special reason why no one's been up there this year," he said with a perceptible hush in his tone. "Not the reason you mean, anyway. Last year it was the fires that kept folks out. And this year, I guess it just happened so, that's all." His manner was clearly meant to be encouraging. Joseph DeFago raised his eyes for a moment, then dropped them again. A breath of wind stole out of the forest and stirred the embers into a passing blaze. Dr. Cathcart again noticed the expression in the guide's face, and again he did not like it. But this time the nature of the look betrayed itself. In those eyes, for an instant, he caught the gleam of a man scared in his very soul. It disquieted him more than he cared to admit. "Bad Indians up that way?" he asked, with a laugh to ease matters a little, while Simpson, too sleepy to notice this subtle byplay, moved off to bed with prodigious yawn. Or anything wrong with the country?" he added, when his nephew was out of hearing. Hank met his eye with something less than the usual frankness. "He's just scared," he replied good-humoredly. "Scared stiff about some old fairy tale, that's all, ain't it, old pard?" And he gave DeFago a friendly kick on the moccasined foot that lay nearest the fire. "Scared? Nothing," he answered with a flush of defiance. "There's nothing in the bush that can scare Joseph DeFago, and don't you forget it." And the natural energy with which he spoke made it impossible to know whether he told the whole truth or only part of it. Hank turned towards the doctor. He was just going to add something when he stopped abruptly and looked around. A sound close behind him in the darkness made all three start. It was old Punk, who had moved up from his lean-to while they had talked, and now stood there just beyond the circle of firelight, listening. "Another time, Doc," Hank whispered with a wink, "when the gallery ain't stepped down into the stalls." And springing to his feet, he slapped the Indian on the back and cried noisily, "Come up to the fire and warm yourself a bit." He dragged him toward the blaze and threw more wood on. "That was a mighty good feed you give us an hour or two back," he continued heartily, as though to set the man's thoughts on another scent. "And it ain't Christian to let you stand out there freezing your old soul to hell while we're getting all good and toasted." Punk moved in and warmed his feet, smiling darkly at the other's volubility, which he only half understood, but saying nothing. And presently Dr. Cathcart, seeing that further conversation was impossible, followed his nephew's example and moved off to the tent, leaving the three men smoking over the now blazing fire. It is not easy to undress in a small tent without waking one's companion, and Cathcart, hardened and warm-blooded as he was in spite of his 50-odd years, did what Hank would have described as considerable of his twilight in the open. He noticed during the process that Punk had meanwhile gone back to his lean-to, and that Hank and DeFago were at it, hammer and tongs, or rather hammer and anvil, the little French-Canadian being the anvil. It was all very like the conventional stage picture of Western melodrama. The fire lighting up their faces with patches of alternative red and black, DeFago in slouch hat and moccasins in the part of the Badlands villain, Hank open-faced and hatless, with the reckless fling of his shoulders, the honest and deceived hero, and old Punk eavesdropping in the background, supplying the atmosphere of mystery. The doctor smiled as he noticed the details, but at the same time something deep within him, he hardly knew what, shrank a little, as though an almost imperceptible breath of warning had touched the surface of his soul and was gone again before he could seize it. Probably it was traceable to that scared expression he had seen in the eyes of DeFago. Probably. For this hint of fugitive emotion otherwise escaped his usually so keen analysis. DeFago, he was vaguely aware, might cause trouble somehow. He was not as steady as a guide as Hank, for instance, further than he could not get. He watched the men a moment longer before diving into the stuffy tent where Simpson already slept soundly. Hank, he saw, was swearing wildly, but it was the swearing of affection. The ridiculous oaths flew freely now that the cause of their obstruction was asleep. Presently he put his arm almost tenderly upon his comrade's shoulder, and they moved off together into the shadows, where their tent stood faintly glimmering. Punk, too, a moment followed later their example and disappeared between his odorous blankets in the opposite direction. Dr. Cathcart then likewise turned in, weariness and sleep still fighting in his mind with an obscure curiosity to know what it was that had scared DeFago about the country up 50 Island Waterway. Wondering, too, why Punk's presence had prevented the completion of what Hank had to say. Then sleep overtook him. He would know tomorrow. Hank would tell him the story while they trudged after the elusive moose. Deep silence fell about the little camp, planted there so audaciously in the jaws of the wilderness that the lake gleamed like a sheet of black glass under the stars. The cold air pricked in the draughts of night that poured their silent tide from the depths of the forest, with messages from distant ridges and from lakes just beginning to freeze. There lay already the faint bleak odors of coming winter. White men with their dull scent might never have divined them. The fragrance of wood fire would have concealed from them these almost electrical hints of moss and bark and hardening swamp 100 miles away. Even Hank and DeFago, subtly in league with the soul of the woods as they were, would probably have spread their delicate nostrils in vain. But an hour later, when all slept like the dead, old Punk crept from his blankets and went down to the shore of the lake like a shadow, silently as only Indian blood can move. He raised his head and looked about him. The thick darkness rendered sight of small avail, but like the animals, he possessed other senses that darkness could not mute. He listened, then sniffed the air. Motionless as a hemlock stem, he stood there. After 5 minutes again, he lifted his head and sniffed, and yet once again, a tingling of the wonderful nerves that betrayed itself by no outer sign ran through him as he tasted the keen air. Then, merging his figure into the surrounding blackness in a way that only wild men and animals understand, he turned still, like a moving shadow, and went stealthily back to his lean-to in bed. And soon after he slept, the change of wind he had divined stirred gently the reflection of the stars within the lake. Rising among the far ridges of the country beyond 50 Island Water, it came from the direction in which he had stared, and it passed over the sleeping camp with a faint and sighing murmur, through the tops of the trees, and was almost too delicate to be audible. With it, down the desert paths of night, through too faint, too high even for the Indian's hair-like nerves, there passed a curious thin odor, strangely disquieting, an odor of something that seemed unfamiliar, utterly unknown. The French Canadian and the man of Indian blood each stirred uneasily in his sleep just about this time, though neither of them woke. Then the ghost of that unforgettably strange odor passed away and was lost among the leagues of tenantless forest beyond. In the morning, the camp was astir before the sun. There had been a light fall of snow during the night, and the air was sharp. Punk had done his duty betimes, for the odors of coffee and fried bacon reached every tent. All were in good spirits. "Wind shifted," cried Hank, vigorously watching Simpson and his guide already loading the small canoe. "It's across the lake, dead right for you fellers. And the snow'll make bully trails. If there's any good moose mussing around up there, they'll not get so much as a tail end scent of you with the wind as it is. Good luck, Monsieur DeFago," he added, facetiously giving the name its French pronunciation for once. DeFago returned the good wishes apparently in his best of spirits, the silent mood gone. Before 8 o'clock, old Punk had the camp to himself. Cathcart and Hank were far along the trail that led westwards, while the canoe that carried DeFago and Simpson, with silk tent and grub for 2 days, was already a dark speck bobbing on the bosom of the lake, going due east. The wintry sharpness of air was tempered now by a sun that topped the wooded ridges and blazed with a luxurious warmth upon the world of lake and forest below. Loons flew skimming through the sparkling spray that the wind lifted. Divers shook their dripping heads to the sun and popped smartly out of sight again. And as far as the eye could reach rose the leagues of endless crowding bush, desolate in its lonely sweep and grandeur, untrodden by foot of man, and stretching its mighty and unbroken carpet right up to the frozen shores of Hudson Bay. Simpson, who saw it all for the first time as he paddled hard in the bows of the dancing canoe, was enchanted by its austere beauty. His heart drank in the sense of freedom in great spaces just as his lungs drank in the cool and perfumed wind. Behind him in the stern seat, singing fragments of his native shanties, DeFago steered the craft of birch bark like a thing of life, answering cheerful all his companions' questions. Both were gay and light-hearted. On such occasions, men lose the superficial, worldly distinctions. They become human beings working together for a common end. Simpson, the employer, and DeFago, the employed, among these primitive forces were simply two men, the guider and the guided. Superior knowledge, of course, assumed control, and the younger man fell without a second thought into the quasi-subordinate position. He never dreamed of objecting when DeFago dropped the Mr. and addressed him as, say, Simpson, or Simpson Boss, which was invariably the case before they reached the farther shore after a stiff paddle of 12 miles against a headwind. He only laughed and liked it, then ceased to notice it all. For this divinity student was a young man of parts and character, though as yet, of course, untraveled, and on this trip, the first time he had seen any country but his own in little Switzerland, the huge scale of things somewhat bewildered him. It was one thing, he realized, to hear about primeval forests, but quite another to see them, while to dwell in them and seek acquaintance with their wildlife was, again, an initiation that no intelligent man could undergo without a certain shifting of personal values hitherto held for permanent and sacred. Simpson knew the first faint indication of this emotion when he held his new .303 rifle in his hand and looked along its pair of faultless gleaming barrels. The 3 days' journey to their headquarters, by a lake in Portage, had carried the process a stage farther, and now he was about to plunge beyond even the fringe of wilderness, where they were camped, into the virgin heart of uninhabited regions as vast as Europe itself. The true nature of the situation stole upon him with an effect of delight and awe that his imagination was fully capable of appreciating. It was himself and DeFago against a multitude, at least against a Titan. The bleak splendors of this remote place and lonely forest rather overwhelmed him with a sense of his own littleness. That stern quality of tangled backwoods, which can only be described as merciless and terrible, rose out of these far blue woods swimming upon the horizon, and revealed itself. He understood the silent warning. He realized his own utter helplessness. Only DeFago, as a symbol of a distant civilization where man was master, stood between him and a pitiless death by exhaustion and starvation. It was thrilling to him, therefore, to watch DeFago turn over the canoe upon the shore, pack the paddles carefully underneath, and then proceed to blaze the spruce pine stems for some distance on either side of an almost invisible trail, with the careless remark thrown in, "Say, Simpson, if anything happens to me, you'll find the canoe all correct by these marks. Then strike due west into the sun to hit the home camp again, see?" It was the most natural thing in the world to say, and he said it without any noticeable inflection of the voice. It only happened to express the youth's emotion at that moment, an utterance that was symbolic of the situation and of his own helplessness as a factor in it. He was alone with DeFago in a primitive world. That was all. The canoe, another symbol of man's ascendancy, was now to be left behind. Those small yellow patches made on these trees by the axe were the only indication of its hiding place. Meanwhile, shouldering the packs between them, each man carrying his own rifle, they followed the slender trail over rocks and fallen trunks and across half-frozen swamps, skirting numerous lakes that fairly gleamed the forest, their borders fringed with mist, and towards 5 o'clock found themselves suddenly on the edge of the woods, looking out across a large sheet of water in front of them, dotted with pine-clad islands of all describable shapes and sizes. 50 island water," announced DeFago warily. "And the sun's just going to dip his bald old head into it," he added with unconscious poetry, and immediately they set about pitching camp for the night. In a very few minutes, under those skillful hands that never made a movement too much or a movement too little, the silk tent stood taut and cozy, the beds of balsam boughs ready laid, and the brisk cooking fire burned with a minimum of smoke. While the young Scotchman cleaned the fish they had caught trolling behind the canoe, DeFago guessed he would just as soon take a turn through the bush for indications of moose. "May come across the trunk where they been and rubbed horns," he said as he moved off. "We're feeding on the last of the maple leaves." And he was gone. His small figure melted away like a shadow in the dusk, while Simpson noted with a kind of admiration how easily the forest absorbed him into herself. A few steps, it seemed, and he was no longer visible. Yet there was little underbrush hereabouts. The trees stood somewhat apart, well spaced. In the clearings grew silver birch and maple, spear-like and slender against the immense stems of spruce and hemlock. But for occasional prostrate monsters, and boulders of gray rock that thrust uncouth shoulders here and there out of the ground, it might well have been a park in the old country. Almost, one might have seen it in the hand of man. A little to the right, however, began a great burnt section, miles in extent, proclaiming its real character, brûlé, as it is called, where the fires of the previous year had raged for weeks, and the blackened stumps now rose gaunt and ugly, bereft of branches like gigantic match heads struck into the ground, savage and desolate beyond words. The perfume of charcoal and rain-soaked ashes still hung faintly about it. The dusk rapidly deepened. The glades grew dark. The crackling of the fire and the wash of little waves along the rocky lake shore were the only audible sounds. The wind had dropped with the sun, and in all that vast world of branches nothing stirred. Any moment, it seemed, the woodland gods, who are to be worshipped in silence and loneliness, might stretch their mighty and terrific outlines among the trees. In front, through doorways pillared by huge straight stems, lay the stretch of 50 Island water, a crescent-shaped lake with some 15 miles from tip to tip, and perhaps 5 miles across where they were camped. A sky of rose and saffron more clear than any atmosphere Simpson had ever known, still dropped its pale streaming fires across the wave, where the islands, 100, surely rather than 50, floated like the fairy barks of some enchanted fleet, fringed with pines, whose crests fingered most delicately the sky. They almost seemed to move upwards as the light faded, about to weigh anchor and navigate the pathways of the heavens instead of the currents of their native and desolate lake. And strips of colored cloud, like flaunting pennons, signaled their departure to the stars. The beauty of the scene was strangely uplifting. Simpson smoked fish and burnt his fingers into the bargain in his efforts to enjoy it, and at the same time tend the frying pan and the fire. Yet ever at the back of his thoughts lay that other aspect of the wilderness, the indifference to human life, the merciless spirit of desolation which took no note of man. The sense of his utter loneliness that now even DeFago had gone came close as he looked about him and listened for the sound of his companion's returning footsteps. There was pleasure in this sensation, yet with it a perfectly comprehensible alarm. And instinctively the thought stirred in him, what should I do? What could I do? If anything happened and he did not come back. They enjoyed their well-earned supper, eating untold quantities of fish, and drinking unmilked tea strong enough to kill men who had not covered 30 miles of hard going, eating little on the way. And when it was over, they smoked and told stories around the blazing fire, laughing, stretching weary limbs, and discussing plans for the morrow. DeFago was in excellent spirits, though, disappointed at having no signs of moose to report. But it was dark, and he had not gone far. The brûlée, too, was bad. His clothes and hands were smeared with charcoal. Simpson, watching him, realized with renewed vividness their position, alone together in the wilderness. "DeFago," he said presently, "these woods, are a bit too big to feel quite at home in, to feel comfortable in." He merely gave expression to the mood of the moment. He was hardly prepared for the earnestness, the solemnity even, with which the guide took him up. "You've hit it right, Simpson, boss," he replied, fixing his searching brown eyes on his face. "And that's the truth, sure. There's no end to 'em, no end at all." Then he added in a lowered tone as if to himself, "There's lots found out that, and plumb gone to pieces." But the man's gravity of manner was not quite to the other's liking. It was a little too suggestive for the scenery and setting. He was sorry he had broached the subject. He remembered suddenly how his uncle had told him that men were sometimes stricken with a strange fever of wilderness, when the seduction of the uninhabited wastes caught them so fiercely that they went forth, half fascinated, half deluded, to their death. And he had a shrewd idea that his companion held something in sympathy with that queer type. He led the conversation onto other topics, onto Hank and the doctor, for instance, and the natural rivalry as to who should get the first sight of moose. "If they went due west," observed Fago carelessly, "there's 60 miles between us now, with old Punk at halfway house eating himself full to busting with fish and coffee." They laughed together over the picture. But the casual mention of those 60 miles again made Simpson realize the prodigious scale of this land. Where they hunted, 60 miles was a mere step. 200 little more than a step. Stories of lost hunters rose persistently before his memory. The passion and mystery of homeless and wandering men, seduced by the beauty of great forests, swept his soul in a way too vivid to be quite pleasant. He wondered vaguely whether it was the mood of his companion that invited the unwelcome suggestion with such persistence. "Sing us a song, DeFago, if you're not too tired," he asked. "One of those old Voyager songs you sang the other night." He handed his tobacco pouch to the guide and then filled his own pipe. While the Canadian, nothing loth, he sent his voice across the lake in one of those plaintive, almost melancholy chanties with which lumbermen and trappers lessen the burden of their labors. There was an appealing and romantic flavor about it, something that recalled the atmosphere of old pioneer days when Indians and the wilderness were leagued together, battles frequent, and the old country farther off than it is today. The sound traveled pleasantly over the water, but the forest at their backs seemed to swallow it down with a single gulp that permitted neither echo nor resonance. It was in the middle of the third verse that Simpson noticed something unusual, something that brought his thoughts back with a rush from faraway scenes. A curious change had come to the man's voice. Even before he knew what it was, uneasiness caught him, and looking up quickly, he saw that DeFago, though still singing, was peering about him into the bush, as though he heard something or saw something. His voice grew fainter, dropped to a hush, then ceased altogether. The same instant, with a movement amazingly alert, he started to his feet and stood upright, sniffing the air, like a dog scenting game. He drew the air into his nostrils in short, sharp breaths, turning quickly as he did so in all directions and finally pointing down the lake shore, eastwards. It was a performance unpleasantly suggestive, and at the same time singularly dramatic. Simpson's heart fluttered disagreeably as he watched. "Lord, man, how you made me jump!" he exclaimed, on his feet beside him in the same instant and peering over his shoulder into the sea of darkness. "What's up? Are you frightened?" Even before the question was out of his mouth, he knew it was foolish, for any man with a pair of eyes in his head could see that the Canadian had turned white down to his very gills. Not even sunburn and the glare of the fire could hide that. The student fell silent himself, trembling a little, weakish in the knees. "What's up?" he repeated quickly. "Do you smell moose? Or anything queer, anything wrong?" He lowered his voice instinctively. The forest pressed in around them, with its encircling wall. The nearer tree stems gleamed like bronze in the firelight beyond that, blackness, and so far as he could tell, a silence of death. Just behind them, a passing puff of wind lifted a single leaf, looked at it, and then laid it down softly again without disturbing the rest of the convey. It seemed as if a million invisible causes had combined just to produce a single visible effect. Other life pulsed about them, and was gone. DeFago turned abruptly. The livid hue of his face had turned a dirty gray. "I never said I heard or smelt nothing," he said slowly and emphatically in an oddly altered voice that conveyed somehow a touch of defiance. "I was only taking a look around, so to speak. It's always a mistake to be too previous with your questions." Then he added suddenly with obvious effort, in his more natural voice, "Hey, you got the matches, Boss Simpson?" and proceeded to light the pipe he had half filled just before he began to sing. Without speaking another word, they sat down again by the fire, DeFago changing his side so that he could face the direction the wind came from, for even a tenderfoot could tell that. DeFago changed his position in order to hear and smell all there was to be heard and smelt, and since he now faced the lake with his back to the trees,
It was evidently nothing in the forest that had sent so strange and sudden a warning to his marvelously trained nerves. "Guess now I don't feel like singing any," he explained presently of his own accord. "That song kinder brings back memories that's troublesome to me. I never oughter even begun it. It sets me on to imagining things, see?" Clearly the man was still fighting with some profoundly moving emotion. He wished to excuse himself in the eyes of the other, but the explanation, in that it was only part of the truth, was a lie, and he knew perfectly well that Simpson was not deceived by it. For nothing could explain away the livid terror that had dropped over his face while he stood there sniffing the air. And nothing, no amount of blazing fire or chatting on ordinary subjects, could make that camp exactly as it had been before. The shadow of an unknown horror, naked if unguessed, that had flashed for an instant in the face and gestures of the guide, that had also communicated itself, vaguely and therefore more potently, to his companion. The guide's visible efforts to dissemble the truth only made things worse. Moreover, to add to the younger man's uneasiness, was the difficulty, nay, the impossibility, he felt of asking questions, and also his complete ignorance as to the cause. Indians, wild animals, forest fires, all these he knew, were wholly out of the question. His imagination searched vigorously, but in vain. Yet, somehow or other, after another long spell of smoking, talking, and roasting themselves before the great fire, the shadow that had so suddenly invaded their peaceful camp began to shift. Perhaps Defago's efforts, or the return of his quiet and normal attitude accomplished this. Perhaps Simpson himself had exaggerated the affair out of all proportion to the truth. Or possibly the vigorous air of the wilderness brought its own powers of healing. Whatever the cause, the feeling of immediate horror seemed to have passed away as mysteriously as it had come, for nothing occurred to feed it. Simpson began to feel that he had permitted himself the unreasoning terror of a child. He put it down partly to a certain subconscious excitement that this wild and immense scenery generated in his blood, partly to the spell of solitude, and partly to over-fatigue. That pallor in the guide's face was, of course, uncommonly hard to explain, yet it might have been due in some way to an effect of the firelight or his own imagination. He gave it the benefit of the doubt. He was Scotch. When a somewhat unordinary emotion has disappeared, the mind always finds a dozen ways of explaining away its causes. Simpson lit a last pipe and tried to laugh to himself. On getting home to Scotland, it would make quite a good story. He did not realize that his laughter was a sign of terror that still lurked in the recesses of his soul. That, in fact, it was merely one of conventional signs by which a man, seriously alarmed, tries to persuade himself that he is not so. Defago, however, heard that low laughter and looked up, with a surprise on his face. The two men stood, side by side, kicking the embers out before going to bed. It was 10 o'clock, a late hour for hunters to be still awake. "What's tickling yer?" he asked, in his ordinary tone, yet gravely. "I was thinking of our little toy-woods at home, just at that moment," stammered Simpson, coming back to what really dominated his mind, and startled by the question. "And comparing 'em to all this," and he swept his arm round to indicate the bush. A pause followed, in which neither of them said anything. "All the same, I wouldn't laugh about it if I was you," Defago added, looking over Simpson's shoulder into the shadows. "There's places in there nobody won't ever see into. Nobody knows what lives in there either." "Too big? Too far off?" The suggestion in the guide's manner was immense and horrible. Defago nodded. The expression on his face was dark. He, too, felt uneasy. The younger man understood that in a hinterland of his size there might well be depths of woods that would never, in the life of the world, be known or trodden. The thought was not exactly the sort he welcomed. In a loud voice, cheerfully, he suggested that it was time for bed, but the guide lingered, tinkering with the fire, arranging the stones needlessly, doing a dozen things that did not really need doing. Evidently, there was something he wanted to say, yet found difficult to get at. "Say, you, Boss Simpson," he began suddenly as the last shower of sparks went up into the air. "You don't smell nothing, do you? Nothing particular, I mean?" The commonplace question, Simpson realized, veiled a dreadfully serious thought in his mind. A shiver ran down his back. "Nothing but burning wood," he replied firmly, kicking again at the embers. The sound of his own foot made him start.
And all the evening you ain't smelled nothing, persisted the guide, peering at him through the gloom. Nothing extraordinary and different to anything else you ever smelt before? No, man, nothing at all, he replied aggressively, half angrily. DeFago's face cleared. That's good, he exclaimed with evident relief. That's good to hear. Have you? Asked Simpson sharply, and the same instant regretted the question. The Canadian came closer in the darkness. He shook his head. I guess not, he said, though without overwhelming conviction. Must have just been that song of mine that did it. It's a song they sing in lumber camps and godforsaken places like that when they're scared the Wendigo's somewhere around doing a bit of swift traveling. And what's a Wendigo, pray? Simpson asked quickly, irritated because again he could not prevent that sudden shiver of nerves. He knew that he was close upon the man's terror and the cause of it, yet a rushing, passionate curiosity overcame his better judgment and fear. DeFago turned swiftly and looked at him as though he were suddenly about to shriek. His eyes shone, but his mouth was wide open. Yet all he said, or whispered rather, for his voice sank very low, was, It's nothing but what those lousy fellers believe when they've been hitting the bottle too long. A sort of great animal that lives up yonder. He jerked his head northwards. Quick as lightning in its tracks, and bigger than anything else in the bush. It ain't supposed to be very good to look at, that's all. A backwoods superstition, began Simpson, moving hastily toward the tent in order to shake off the hand of the guide that clutched his arm. Come, hurry, for God's sakes, and let's get the lantern going. It's time we're in bed and asleep if we're going to be up tomorrow with the sun. The guide was close on his heels. I'm coming, he answered out of the darkness. I'm coming. And after a slight delay, he appeared with a lantern and hung it from a nail in the front pole of the tent. The shadows of 100 trees shifted their places quickly as he did so, and when he stumbled over the rope, diving swiftly inside, the whole tent trembled as though a gust of wind struck it. The two men lay down without undressing, upon their bed of soft balsam boughs, cunningly arranged. Inside, all was warm and cozy, but outside the world of crowding trees pressed close about them, marshalling their million shadows and smothering the little tent that stood there like a wee white shell, facing the ocean of tremendous forest. Between the two lonely figures within, however, there pressed another shadow that was not a shadow from the night. It was the shadow cast by the strange fear, never wholly exorcised, that had leaped suddenly upon DeFago in the middle of his singing, and Simpson, as he lay there, watching the darkness through the open flap and ready to plunge into the fragrant abyss of sleep, knew first that unique and profound stillness of a primeval forest, when no wind stirs, and when the night has weight and substance that enters into the soul to bind a veil about it, then sleep took him. Thus, it seemed to him at least. Yet it was true that the lap of the water, just beyond the tent door, still beat time with his lessening pulses when he realized that he was lying with his eyes open, and that another sound had recently introduced itself with cunning softness between the splash and murmur of the little waves. And long before he understood what this sound was, it had stirred him in the centers of pity and alarm. He listened intently, though at first in vain, for the running blood beat all its drums too noisily in his ear. Did it come, he wondered, from the lake or from the woods? Then suddenly, with a rush and a flutter of the heart, he knew that it was close beside him in the tent, and when he turned over for a better hearing, it focused itself unmistakably not 2 feet away. It was the sound of weeping. DeFago, upon his bed of branches, was sobbing in the darkness, as though his heart would break, the blankets evidently stuffed against his mouth to stifle it. And his first feeling, before he could think or reflect, was the rush of a poignant and searching tenderness. This intimate, human sound, heard amid the desolation about them, woke pity. It was incongruous, so pitifully incongruous, and so vain. Tears, in this vast and cruel wilderness, of what avail? He thought of a little child crying in mid-Atlantic. Then, of course, with fuller realization, and the memory of what had gone before, came the descent of terror upon him, and his blood ran cold. "DeFago," he whispered. "What's the matter?" He tried to make his voice very gentle. "Are you in pain? Unhappy?" There was no reply, but the sound ceased abruptly. He stretched his hand out and touched him. The body did not stir. "Are you awake?" It occurred to him the man was crying in his sleep. "Are you cold?" He noticed that his feet, which were uncovered, projected beyond the mouth of the tent. He spread an extra fold of his own blankets over them. The guide had slipped down in his bed. The branches seemed to have been dragged with him. He was afraid to pull the body back again for fear of waking him. One or two tentative questions he ventured softly, but though he waited for several minutes, there came no reply or any sign of movement. Presently he heard his regular and quiet breathing, and putting his hand again gently on the breast, felt the steady rise and fall beneath. "Let me know if anything's wrong," he whispered, "or if I can do anything. Wake me at once if you feel queer." He hardly knew what to say. He lay down again, thinking and wondering what it all meant. Defago, of course, had been crying in his sleep. Some dream or other had afflicted him. Yet never in his life would he forget the pitiful sound of sobbing and the feeling that the whole awful wilderness of woods listened. His own mind busied itself for a long time with recent events, of which this took its mysterious place as one. And though his reason successfully argued away all unwelcome suggestions, a sensation of uneasiness remained, resisting ejection, very deep-seated, peculiar beyond ordinary. But sleep in the long run proves greater than all emotions. His thoughts soon wandered again. He lay there, warm as toast, exceedingly weary. The night soothed and comforted, blunting the edges of memory and alarm. Half an hour later, he was oblivious of everything in the outer world about him. Yet sleep in this case was his great enemy, concealing all approaches, smothering the warning of his nerves. As sometimes, in a nightmare, events crowd upon each other's heels, with a conviction of dreadfulest reality, yet some inconsistent detail accuses the whole world display of incompleteness and disguise. So the events that now followed, though they actually happened, persuaded the mind somehow that the detail which could explain them all had been overlooked in the confusion, and that therefore they were but partly true, the rest delusion. At the back of the sleeper's mind, something remains awake, ready to let slip the judgment. All this is not quite real. When you wake up, you'll understand. And thus, in a way, it was with Simpson. The events, not wholly inexplicable or incredible in themselves, yet remained for the man who saw and heard them a sequence of separate facts of cold horror, because the little piece that might have made the puzzle clear lay concealed or overlooked. So far as he can recall, it was a violent movement, running downwards through the tent towards the door, that first woke him and made him aware that his companion was sitting bolt upright beside him, quivering. Hours must have passed, for it was the pale gleam of the dawn that revealed his outline against the canvas. This time the man was not crying. He was quaking like a leaf. The trembling he felt plainly through the blankets down the entire length of his own body. Defago had huddled down against him for protection, shrinking away from something that apparently concealed itself near the door flaps of the little tent. Simpson, thereupon, cried out in a loud voice some question or other. In the first bewilderment of waking, he does not remember what exactly, and the man made no reply. The atmosphere and feeling of true nightmare lay horribly about him, making movement and speech both difficult. At first, indeed, he was not sure where he was, whether in one of the earlier camps or at home in his bed in Aberdeen. The sense of confusion was very troubling. And next, almost simultaneously with his waking, it seemed, the profound stillness of the dawn outside was shattered by a most uncommon sound. It came without warning or audible approach, and it was unspeakably dreadful. It was a voice, Simpson declares, possibly a human voice, hoarse yet plaintive, a soft roaring voice close outside the tent, overheard rather than upon the ground, of immense volume, while in some strange way, most penetratingly and seductively sweet. It rang out, too, in 3 separate distinct notes or cries that bore in some odd fashion the resemblance, far-fetched yet recognizable, to the name of the guide, Defago. The student admits he is unable to describe it quite intelligently, for it was unlike any sound he had ever heard in his life, and combined a blending of such contrary qualities, a sort of windy, crying voice, he calls it, as something of lonely and untamed wild of abominable power. And even before it ceased, dropping back into the great gulfs of silence, the guide beside him had sprung to his feet with an answering though unintelligible cry.
He blundered against the tent pole with violence, shaking the whole structure, spreading his arms out frantically for more room and kicking his legs impetuously free of the clinging blankets. For a second or two, perhaps, he stood upright by the door, his outline dark against the pallor of dawn. Then, with a furious rushing speed, before his companion could move a hand to stop him, he shot out with a plunge through the flaps of canvas and was gone. And as he went, so astonishingly fast that the voice could actually be heard dying in the distance, he called aloud in tones of anguished terror that at the same time held something strangely like a frenzied exultation of delight. "Oh, my feet of fire! My burning feet of fire! Oh, oh, this hiding fiery speed!" And then the distance quickly buried it, and the deep silence of a very early morning descended upon the forest as before. It had all come about with such rapidity that, but for the evidence of the empty bed beside him, Simpson could almost have believed it to be the memory of a nightmare carried over from sleep. He still felt the warm pressure of that vanished body against his side. There lay the twisted blankets in a heap. The very tent yet trembled with vehemence of the impetuous departure. The strange words rang in his ears, as though he still heard them in the distance, wild language of a suddenly stricken mind. Moreover, it was not only the senses of sight and hearing that reported uncommon things to his brain, for even while the man cried and ran, he had become aware of that strange perfume, faint yet pungent, pervaded the interior of the tent. And it was at this point, it seems, brought to himself by the consciousness that his nostrils were taking this distressing odor down into his throat, that he found his courage, sprang quickly to his feet, and went out. The gray light of dawn that dropped, cold and glimmering, between the trees revealed that scene tolerably well. There stood the tent behind him, soaked with dew and dark ashes of the fire, still warm, the lake white beneath the coating of mist, the islands rising darkly out of it, like objects packed in wool, and patches of snow beyond, among the clearer spaces of the bush, everything cold, still waiting for the sun, but nowhere a sign of the vanished guide, still, doubtless, flying at frantic speed through the frozen woods. There was not even the sound of disappearing footsteps, nor the echoes of the dying voice. He had gone, utterly. There was nothing but the sense of his recent presence, so strongly left behind about the camp, and this penetrating, all-pervading odor. And even this was now rapidly disappearing in its turn. In spite of his exceedingly mental perturbation, Simpson struggled hard to detect its nature and define it, but the ascertaining of an elusive scent not recognized subconsciously and at once is a very subtle operation of the mind. And he failed. It was gone before he could properly seize or name it. Approximate description, even, seems to have been difficult, for it was unlike any smell he knew. Acrid, rather. Not unlike the odor of a lion, he thinks, yet softer and not wholly unpleasing, with something almost sweet in it that reminded him of the scent of decaying garden leaves, earth, and the myriad of nameless perfumes that make up the odor of a big forest. Yet the odor of lions is the phrase with which he usually sums it all up. Then it was wholly gone, and he found himself standing by the ashes of a fire in the state of amazement and stupid terror that left him the helpless prey of anything that chose to happen. Had a muskrat poked its pointed muzzle over a rock, or a squirrel scuttled in that instant down the bark of a tree, he would most likely have collapsed without more ado and fainted, for he felt about the whole affair the touch somewhere of a great outer horror, and his scattered powers had not as yet had time to collect themselves into a definite attitude of fighting self-control. Nothing did happen, however. A great kiss of wind ran softly through the awakening forest, and a few maple leaves here and there rustled trembling to the earth. The sky seemed to grow suddenly much lighter. Simpson felt the cool air rush upon his cheek and uncovered head, realized that he was shivering with the cold, and, making a great effort, realized next he was alone in the bush, and that he was called upon to take immediate steps to find and succor his vanished companion. Make an effort, accordingly, he did, though an ill-calculated and futile one. With that wilderness of trees about him, the sheet of water cutting him off behind, and the horror of that wild cry in his blood, he did what any other inexperienced man would have done in similar bewilderment. He ran about, without any sense of direction, like a frantic child, and called loudly without ceasing the name of the guide. "Defago! Defago! Defago!" he yelled,
and the trees gave him back the name as often as he shouted, only a little softened. He followed the trail that lay in short distance across patches of snow. Then he lost it again, where the trees grew too thickly for snow to lie. He shouted till he was hoarse, and till the sound of his own voice, in that all unanswering and listening world, began to frighten him. His confusion increased in direct ratio to the violence of his efforts. His distress became formidably acute, till at length his exertions defeated their own object, and from sheer exhaustion he headed back to the camp again. It remains a wonder that he ever found his way. It was with great difficulty, and only after numberless false clues, that he at last saw the white tent between the trees, and so reached safety. Exhaustion then applied its own remedy, and he grew calmer. He made the fire and breakfast. Hot coffee and bacon put a little sense and judgment into him again, and he realized that he had been behaving like a boy. He now made another and more successful attempt to face the situation collectedly, and, a nature naturally plucky coming to his assistance, he decided that he must first make as thorough a search as possible, failing success in which he must find his way into the home camp as best he could and bring help. And this is what he did, taking food, matches and rifle with him, and a small axe to blaze the trees against his return journey. He set forth. It was 8 o'clock when he started, the sun shining over the tops of the trees in a sky without clouds. Pinned to a stake by the fire, he left a note in case Defago returned while he was away. This time, according to a careful plan, he took a new direction, intending to make a wide sweep that must sooner or later cut into indications of the guide's trail. And, before he had gone a quarter of a mile, he came across the tracks of a large animal in the snow, and beside it the light and smaller tracks of what were beyond question human feet, the feet of Defago. The relief he at once experienced was natural, though brief, for at first sight he saw these tracks as simple explanation for the whole number. These big marks had surely been left by a bull moose that, wind against it, had blundered upon the camp and uttered its singular cry of warning and alarm the moment its mistake was apparent. Defago, in whom the hunting instinct was developed to the point of uncanny perfection, had scented the brute coming down the wind hours before. His excitement and disappearance were due, of course, to his. Then the impossible explanation at which he grasped faded, as common sense showed him mercilessly that none of this was true. No guide, much less a guide like Defago, could have acted in so irrational a way, even going off without his rifle. The whole affair demanded a far more complicated elucidation. When he remembered the details of it all, the cry of terror, the amazing language, the grave face of horror when his nostrils first caught the new odor, that muffled sobbing in the darkness, and, for this, too, now came back to him dimly, the man's original aversion for this particular bit of country. Besides, now that he examined them closer, these were not the tracks of a bull moose at all. Hank had explained to him the outline of a bull's hooves, of a cow and calf's too, for that matter. He had drawn them clearly on a strip of birch bark, and these were wholly different. They were big, round, ample, and with no pointed outline as sharp as hooves. He wondered for a moment whether bear tracks were like that. There was no other animal he could think of, for caribou did not come so far south at this season, and, even if they did, would leave hoof marks. There were ominous signs. These mysterious writings left in the snow by the unknown creature that had lured a human being away from safety, and when he coupled them in his imagination with that haunting sound that broke the stillness of dawn, a momentary dizziness shook his mind, distressing him again beyond belief. He felt the threatening aspect of it all, and stooping down to examine the marks more closely, he caught a faint whiff of that sweet yet pungent odor that made him instantly straighten up again, fighting a sensation almost of nausea. Then his memory played him another evil trick. He suddenly recalled those uncovered feet projecting beyond the edge of the tent, and the body's appearance of having been dragged toward the opening, the man shrinking away from something by the door when he woke later. The details now beat against his trembling mind with concerted attack. They seemed to gather in those deep spaces of the silent forest about him, where the host of trees stood waiting, listening, watching to see what he would do. The woods were closing round him. With the persistence of true pluck, however, Simpson went forward, following the tracks as best he could, smothering these ugly emotions that sought to weaken him. He blazed innumerable trees as he went, ever fearful of being unable to find the way back,
and calling aloud at intervals of a few seconds the name of the guide. The dull tapping of the axe upon the massive trunks and the unnatural accents of his own voice became at length sounds that even he dreaded to make, dreaded to hear. For they drew attention without ceasing to his presence the exact whereabouts, and if it were really the case that something was hunting himself down in the same way that he was hunting down another, with a strong effort he crushed the thought out the instant it rose. It was the beginning, he realized, of a bewilderment utterly diabolical in kind that would speedily destroy him. Although the snow was not continuous, lying merely in shallow flurries over the more open spaces, he found no difficulty in following the tracks for the first few miles. They went straight as a ruled line wherever the trees permitted. The stride soon began to increase in length, till it finally assumed proportions that seemed absolutely impossible for any ordinary animal to have made. Like huge flying leaps they became. One of these he measured, and though he knew that stretch of 18 feet must somehow be wrong, he was at a complete loss to understand why he found no signs on the snow between the extreme points. But what perplexed him even more, making him feel his vision had gone utterly awry, was that Defago's stride increased in the same manner, and finally covered the same incredible distance. It looked as if the great beast had lifted him with it and carried him across these astonishing intervals. Simpson, who was much longer in the limb, found that he could not compass even half the stretch by taking a running jump, and the sight of these huge tracks running side by side, silent evidence of a dreadful journey in which terror or madness had urged to impossible results, was profoundly moving. It shocked him in the secret depths of his soul. It was the most horrible thing his eyes had ever looked upon. He began to follow them mechanically, absent-mindedly almost, ever peering over his shoulder to see if he, too, were being followed by something with a gigantic tread. And soon it came about that he no longer quite realized what it was they signified. These impressions left upon the snow by something nameless and untamed, always accompanied by the footmarks of the little French-Canadian guide, his comrade, the man who had shared his tent a few hours before, chatting and laughing, even singing by his side. For a man of his years and inexperience, only a canny Scot, perhaps, grounded in common sense and established in logic, could have preserved even that measure of balance that his youth somehow or other did manage to preserve through the whole adventure. Otherwise, two things he presently noticed, while forging pluckily ahead, must have sent him headlong back to the comparative safety of his tent, instead of only making his hands close more tightly upon the rifle stock, while his heart, trained for the wee kirk, sent a wordless prayer winging its way to heaven. Both tracks, he saw, had undergone a change, and this change, so far as it concerned the footsteps of man, was in some undecipherable manner appalling. It was in the bigger tracks that he first noticed this, and for a long time he could not quite believe his eyes. Was it the blown leaves that produced odd effects of light and shade, or that the dry snow, drifting like finely ground rice about the edges, cast the shadows and highlights? Or was it actually the fact that the great marks had become faintly colored? For round about the deep plunging holes of the animal there now appeared a mysterious reddish tinge that was more like an effect of light than anything that dyed the substance of the snow itself. Every mark had it, and had it increasingly, this indistinct fiery tinge that painted a new touch of ghastliness into the picture. But when, wholly unable to explain it or credit it, he turned his attention to the other tracks to discover if they, too, bore similar witness, he noticed that these had meanwhile undergone a change that was infinitely worse, and charged with far more horrible suggestion, for, in the last 100 yards or so, he saw that they had grown gradually into the semblance of the parent tread. Imperceptibly the change had come about, yet unmistakable. It was hard to see where the change first began. The result, however, was beyond question. Smaller, neater, and more cleanly modeled, they formed now an exact and careful duplicate of the larger tracks beside them. The feet that produced them had, therefore, also changed. And something in his mind reared up with loathing and with terror as he saw it. Simpson, for the first time, hesitated, then, ashamed of his alarm and indecision, took a few hurried steps ahead. The next instant stopped dead in his tracks. The next instant stopped dead in his tracks. Immediately in front of him, all signs of the trail ceased. Both tracks came to an abrupt end. On all sides, for 100 yards or more, he searched in vain for the least indication of their continuance. There was nothing. The trees were very thick just there, Big trees, all of them, spruce, cedar, hemlock. There was no underbrush. He stood looking about him, all distraught, bereft of any power of judgment. Then he set to work to search again, and yet again, but always with the same result. Nothing. The feet that had printed the surface of the snow thus far had now apparently left the ground. And it was in that moment of distress and confusion that the whip of terror laid its most nicely calculated lash about his heart. It dropped with deadly effect upon the sore spot of all, completely unnerving him. He had been secretly dreading all this time that it would come, and come it did. Far overhead, muted by great height and distance, strangely thinned and wailing, he heard the crying voice of Defago, the guide. The sound dropped upon him out of that still, wintry sky with an effect of dismay and terror unsurpassed. The rifle fell to his feet. He stood motionless in an instant, listening as it were with his whole body, then staggered back against the nearest tree for support, disorganized hopelessly in his mind and spirit. To him, in this moment, it seemed the most shattering and dislocating experience he had ever known, so that his heart emptied itself of all feeling whatsoever, as by a sudden draught. "Oh, oh, this fiery height! Oh, the feet of fire! My burning feet of fire!" Ran in far, beseeching accents of indescribable appeal, his voice of anguish down the sky. Once it called, then silenced through all the listening wilderness of the trees. And Simpson, scarcely knowing what he did, presently found himself running wildly to and fro, searching, calling, tripping over roots and boulders, and flinging himself in a frenzy of undirected pursuit after the caller. Behind the screen of memory and emotion with which experience veils events, he plunged, distracted and half deranged, picking up false light like a ship at sea, terror in his eyes and heart and soul, for the panic of the wilderness had called to him in that far voice the power of untamed distance, the enticement of the desolation that destroys. He knew in that moment all the pains of someone hopelessly and irretrievably lost, suffering the lust and travail of a soul in the final loneliness, a vision of Defago eternally hunted, driven and pursued across the skyey vastness of those ancient forests, fled like a flame across the dark ruin of his thoughts. It seemed ages before he could find anything in the chaos of his disorganized sensations to which he could anchor himself steady for a moment and think. The cry was not repeated. His own hoarse calling brought no response. The inscrutable forces of the wild had summoned their victim beyond recall and held him fast. Yet he searched and called, it seems, for hours afterward, for it was late in the afternoon when at length he decided to abandon a useless pursuit and return to his camp on the shore of the 50-island water. Even then he went with reluctance, that crying voice still echoing in his ears. With difficulty he found his rifle and homeward trail. The concentration necessary to follow the badly blazed trees and the biting hunger that gnawed helped to keep his mind steady. Otherwise, he admits, the temporary aberration that he suffered might have been prolonged to the point of positive disaster. Gradually, the ballast shifted back again, and he regained something that approached his normal equilibrium. But for all that, the journey through the gathering dusk was miserably haunted. He heard innumerable following footsteps, voices that laughed and whispered, and saw figures crouching behind trees and boulders, making signs to one another for a concerted attack the moment he had passed. The creeping murmur of the wind made him start and listen. He went stealthily, trying to hide where possible, and making as little sound as he could. The shadows of the woods, hitherto protective or covering merely, had now become menacing, challenging, and the pageantry in his frightened mind masked a host of possibilities that were all more ominous for being obscure. The presentiment of a nameless doom lurked ill-concealed behind every detail of what happened. It was really admirable how he emerged victor in the end. Men of riper powers and experience might have come through the ordeal with less success. He had himself tolerably well in hand, all things considered, and his plan of action proves it. Sleep being absolutely out of the question, and traveling an unknown trail in the darkness equally impractical, he sat up the whole of that night, rifle in hand, before a fire he never for a single moment allowed to die down. The severity of the haunted vigil marked his soul for life, but it was successfully accomplished. And with the very first signs of dawn, he set forth upon the long return journey to the home camp to get help. As before, he left a written note to explain his absence, and to indicate where he had left a plentiful cache of food and matches, though he had no expectation that any human hands would find them. How Simpson found his way alone by the lake and forest might well make a story in itself, for to hear him tell it is to know the passionate loneliness of soul that a man can feel when the wilderness holds him in the hollow of its illimitable hand and laughs. It is also to admire his indomitable pluck. He claims no skill, declaring that he followed the almost invisible trail mechanically and without thinking. And this, doubtless, is the truth. He relied upon the guiding of the unconscious mind, which is instinct, perhaps, too, some sense of orientation, known to animal and primitive men, may have helped as well. For through all that tangled region he succeeded in reaching the exact spot where Defago had hidden the canoe nearly 3 days before with remark,
"Strike due west, across the lake into the sun to find the camp."
There was not much sun left to guide him, but he used his compass to the best of his ability, embarking in the frail craft to the last 12 miles of his journey, with a sensation of immense relief that the forest was at last behind him. And, fortunately, the water was calm. He took his line across the center of the lake, instead of coasting round the shore for another 20 miles. Fortunately, too, the other hunters were back. The light of their fires furnished a steering point, without which he might have searched all night long for the actual position of the camp. It was close upon midnight, all the same, when his canoe grated on the sandy cove, and Hank, Punk, and his uncle, disturbed in their sleep by his cries, ran quickly down and helped a very exhausted and broken specimen of Scotch humanity over the rocks toward a dying fire.
And that is the end of part 1. Once again, thank you for joining us for this. We hope you enjoyed the story. If you did, please leave us a 5-star rating wherever you're listening, and a quick review also goes a long way. It doesn't have to be anything important. You could say whatever you want. You could say zippity-doo-dah. We really don't care, but it definitely helps us a lot.
And as always, the intro was provided by Travis Bilger, and artwork was provided by Mark Parlier Jr.
Once again, please join our Discord. Link to it will be in the description of the episode. Thank you and good night.
Good night.